He grabbed my wrist so hard it bruised. I was his new commanding officer. I know that sounds insane. Let me tell you how I got there. I was 28 years old but looked about 19, which meant people constantly assumed I was too young for whatever job I had. I got carded at R-rated movies. Bartenders asked for 2 forms of ID. And cops at new precincts always thought I was someone's daughter dropping off lunch. That Friday, I walked into the precinct 3 days before my official start date to drop off some paperwork and get my locker assignment. The place smelled like burnt coffee and old sweat, with that weird mix of disinfectant trying to cover up something worse. I approached the front desk where a bored officer sat reading a newspaper, not even looking up when I cleared my throat. I told him I needed to speak with Captain Reynolds about my assignment, and he just pointed toward the back without raising his eyes from the sports section. I walked through the bullpen where about a dozen officers sat at metal desks covered in files and coffee cups. Most of them ignored me completely. A few looked up with mild curiosity, probably wondering if I was lost. One older guy with gray hair and sergeant stripes smiled in a way that made my skin crawl, like he was already sizing me up for something. He stood up from his desk and walked toward me, moving into my space way too fast. He asked if I needed help finding someone, his breath smelling like cigarettes and mint gum trying to hide it. I stepped back and said I was looking for Captain Reynolds, keeping my voice professional and steady. He moved closer again, invading my personal space in a way that felt deliberate. He told me the captain was busy and maybe he could help me instead, his eyes traveling down my body in a way that made me want to punch him. I pulled out my badge to show him I was a cop, not some random civilian, but he just laughed and grabbed my wrist before I could hold it up properly. His fingers dug into my skin hard enough that I knew it would leave marks. He leaned in close, his face inches from mine, and told me that little girls who play dress up with their daddy's badge should go home before they get hurt. The other officers in the room went silent, watching, and not one of them said a word to stop him. I tried to pull my wrist free, but his grip got tighter, his thumb pressing into the pulse point until pain shot up my arm. He smiled wider, enjoying my discomfort, and asked if I wanted to see what real police work looked like, or if I should run along and let the grown-ups handle things. My heart pounded so hard I thought everyone could hear it. I opened my mouth to tell him to let go, to show him my actual sergeant stripes, to do something other than stand there frozen. Then a door slammed open behind me and a voice cut through the room like a gunshot. The captain stood in his office doorway, his face red with anger, asking what the hell was going on in his precinct. Every officer in the room suddenly found something fascinating on their desk to look at. The guy holding my wrist dropped it immediately, stepping back like I had burned him instead of the other way around. A red mark circled my wrist where his fingers had been, already starting to darken into what would definitely bruise by tomorrow. I pulled my badge out again, holding it up high so everyone in the room could see the sergeant stripes clearly displayed on the leather. My voice came out steadier than I felt when I said I was Sergeant Miller and I started Monday. The color drained from the guy's face so fast he looked like he might pass out right there in the middle of the bullpen. His mouth opened and closed a few times, but no sound came out, his hands shaking at his sides. He fumbled with his own badge, trying to unclip it from his belt to show the captain, but his fingers wouldn't cooperate. The badge fell from his trembling hands and clattered across the floor, the metal making a sharp ringing sound in the dead silent room. Sweat poured down his temples even though the precinct was cold, and he kept trying to form words that wouldn't come. The captain's expression could have frozen hell as he looked from the guy to me and back again. He pointed at his office and said one word that somehow contained all his rage. Now. Then he looked at the other officers who had been watching the whole thing like it was entertainment, telling them they were all coming too, everyone who thought this was funny or acceptable. 6 officers filed past me with their heads down, not making eye contact, their faces ranging from pale to bright red with shame or anger or both. I stood alone in the lobby while voices rose behind the captain's closed door, my wrist throbbing where that guy had grabbed me. The desk officer who had ignored me earlier finally looked up from his paperwork, his face pale, and asked quietly if I needed ice or wanted to file a formal complaint. I told him maybe on the ice and I needed to think about the complaint. He nodded and disappeared into a back room, returning with a plastic bag full of ice cubes wrapped in a thin towel. I pressed it against my wrist, the cold helping with the pain, but not with the sick feeling in my stomach. 20 minutes passed while I sat in a plastic chair in the lobby, listening to muffled yelling through the captain's door. Finally, the door opened and the captain emerged, his face still tight with anger, asking me to step into his office while the other officers waited outside. His office was small and cluttered with files and commendations on the walls, a desk covered in paperwork, and a coffee mug that said, "World's Okayest Boss." He gestured for me to sit in the chair across from his desk and close the door behind us. He apologized for what happened, his voice tired and frustrated, explaining this was exactly the kind of behavior he was brought in to eliminate from the precinct. He had been captain for only 6 months, transferred in specifically because the department knew the culture here was toxic and needed someone willing to make hard changes. He asked if I wanted to press charges or file an official complaint, making it clear he would support whatever decision I made and would not let anyone retaliate against me for speaking up. I sat there looking at my wrist, at the bruises already forming in the perfect shape of that guy's fingers, and told him I needed time to think about it. He nodded and said the offer stood indefinitely, that he had already documented everything he witnessed, and taken statements from several officers who saw what happened. I left the precinct 30 minutes later and sat in my car in the parking lot, my hands still shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. The way that guy touched me, grabbed me, threatened me, it kept playing on repeat in my head like a bad movie I couldn't turn off. I felt angry at myself for freezing instead of fighting back immediately, for not pulling away harder, for letting him see he scared me. I drove home and spent the rest of Friday trying not to think about Monday, about walking into that precinct as their new sergeant, about having to work with people who watched me get assaulted and did nothing. That weekend I couldn't stop thinking about it. So I did what I always do when I need to feel in control. I researched. I pulled up everything I could find on the guy who grabbed me, whose name I learned was Gareth Malone. 19 years with the department, multiple commendations for bravery, 2 medals for going above and beyond in dangerous situations. On paper, he looked like a model officer, someone the department was proud of, someone they put on recruiting posters. It made me wonder how many other incidents were buried or were ignored over the years, how many other women he had grabbed or threatened or worse. Monday morning arrived too fast. I put on my uniform, checking my reflection in the mirror to make sure I looked professional, and like someone who deserved the sergeant stripes on my shoulders despite being 5'3". I arrived at the precinct 30 minutes early, finding the parking lot nearly empty except for a few early shift officers heading inside. The desk officer from Friday stood up when I walked through the front doors, nodding at me with what looked like actual respect instead of the bored dismissal from before. He pulled out a clipboard and pointed to where I needed to sign in, his voice quiet when he told me that Malone got suspended pending investigation, and that several officers caught discipline for their part in what happened. I signed my name on the log sheet while he explained where my locker was located and which briefing room the captain wanted me in for roll call. Other officers moved through the lobby around us, some glancing over with curiosity, others pretending not to notice me at all. The building felt different from Friday, less hostile but still wary, like everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. I thanked the desk officer and headed toward the locker room, my footsteps echoing on the tile floor. The hallway smelled like industrial cleaner and old coffee, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. I found my locker easily enough, the metal door already labeled with my name and badge number. Inside, someone had left a fresh uniform shirt still in plastic and a copy of the precinct handbook. I changed quickly, checking my appearance in the small mirror stuck to the inside of the locker door. The sergeant's stripes looked foreign on my shoulders still, like they belonged to someone else. I closed the locker and made my way to the briefing room where morning roll call was about to start. The room went silent when I walked in, about 20 officers sitting in rows of chairs facing the front podium. Some looked at me with open curiosity, others with what might have been resentment, a few with blank expressions that gave nothing away. The captain stood at the podium shuffling papers, looking up when I entered and gesturing for me to take a seat in the front row. He called the room to order and went through the usual announcements about shift assignments and ongoing cases before introducing me to everyone. His voice was professional and firm when he said I was Sergeant Miller and that I came with strong recommendations from my previous department. The mandatory acknowledgments came back flat and unenthusiastic, just officers saying yes sir because they had to, not because they wanted to. I could feel the tension in the room like something physical, pressing down on everyone, making the air feel thick and hard to breathe. Some officers were mad at me for causing trouble with Malone. You could see it in how they sat with their arms crossed and jaws tight. Others seemed curious about whether I could actually do the job, or if I was just someone who got promoted too fast because of politics or quotas or whatever excuse they wanted to use. The captain finished roll call and started reading out patrol assignments, pairing officers up for the day shift. When he got to my name, he paired me with a veteran detective named Daryl McMillan, who had 23 years on the force according to the captain's introduction. Daryl stood up from his seat in the back row, a tall black man with gray at his temples and tired eyes that had seen too much. He nodded at me without smiling, his face giving nothing away about what he thought of being assigned to babysit the new sergeant. We walked out to the parking lot together in silence, the morning sun already hot even though it was barely 8. Daryl drove us in an unmarked sedan that smelled like old French fries and air freshener trying to cover up cigarette smoke. He kept his eyes on the road while we pulled out of the lot, not saying anything for the first few blocks. Then he started asking me questions about procedure and local ordinances, stuff that any sergeant should know cold. He asked about response protocols for armed suspects, about proper evidence handling, about when to call for backup versus handling situations ourselves. I answered each question correctly, adding context from my previous department where relevant, explaining how we handled similar situations there. He nodded after each answer but didn't offer any feedback, just moved on to the next question. We drove through residential neighborhoods where kids played in yards and people sat on porches drinking coffee. Daryl kept testing me, throwing out scenarios and asking how I would handle them, watching my face while I talked through my reasoning. After about an hour of this, he finally spoke something that wasn't a test question, telling me that the precinct had problems with how things were done before, and that change was hard for people who liked the old ways. I said I understood that, but also that some things needed to change if they were wrong. He nodded slowly at that, like maybe I had passed some kind of test he was running. The radio crackled with a domestic disturbance call about 3 blocks from our location, dispatch giving an address where neighbors reported shouting and breaking glass. Daryl looked at me and asked if I wanted to take lead on this one, his tone suggesting this was another test. I said yes, and he drove us to the address, a small house with peeling paint and toys scattered across the front lawn. We could hear yelling from inside before we even got out of the car, a man's voice loud and angry, a woman's voice crying. Daryl pulled his radio and told dispatch we were on scene, then looked at me waiting to see what I would do. I approached the front door and knocked hard, identifying myself as police and asking whoever was inside to open up. The yelling stopped for a second, then the door flew open and a man stumbled out, drunk even though it was morning, his eyes red and unfocused. He started yelling at us about how this was his house and we had no right to be there, his breath smelling like whiskey and his hands balled into fists. Behind him, I could see a woman with a bloody lip holding a kid who looked about 5. The situation was escalating fast, the husband getting more aggressive, stepping toward me like he wanted to intimidate me with his size. I kept my voice calm and steady, telling him we just wanted to make sure everyone was okay, and that nobody needed to get arrested if he could just calm down. He kept yelling about his rights and how his wife was a liar and how we needed to leave his property. I could see Daryl watching me from the side, his hand near his weapon but not on it, letting me handle this but ready to step in if needed. I kept talking to the husband, using his name that the woman had called out, making eye contact, keeping my body language non-threatening but firm. I told him I understood he was upset, but that yelling wasn't going to help anyone, and that we could talk about this calmly. It took maybe 10 minutes of this, going back and forth while he slowly came down from whatever rage had him wound up. Finally, he sat down on the front steps and put his head in his hands, the fight going out of him all at once. The woman came outside with the kid, and I took her statement while Daryl kept an eye on the husband. She said he had been drinking since last night and got mad about something stupid, threw a plate at the wall, pushed her when she tried to leave. The kid buried his face in her shoulder, too scared to look at any of us. I asked if she wanted to press charges and she shook her head, saying she just wanted him to sleep it off somewhere else for the night. We arranged for the husband to stay with his brother, making sure he understood that if we got called back here there would be consequences.